Hi everyone, so for my research project, I focused on whitewashing in education and kind of its effects through the usage of textbooks and other materials in the classroom. So, what is whitewashing in education? So, basically, whitewashing and minority erasure in the education system can be defined as a racist practice of removing an accurate representation of history through the usage of textbooks, films, and other educational resources. So if you look at the right, this cartoon is actually one of the most prominent cartoons that's used to kind of represent how the United States whitewashes its history to its students, and how kind of it creates a false representation of history that, students are faced with in the classroom due to textbooks and other resources that are created from the Americanized perspective. Also, this kind of goes into, racial realists who unfortunately believe that whitewashing in education ended after the civil rights movement, which kind of continues the false reality of, you know, racism in the American education system being completely erased from its classrooms and, from the textbooks and resources that teachers and other administrators use. So basically, control of memory goes hand in hand with a whitewashed education. So this ultimately creates social control over students. And the example that I found states, the standards controversy exemplifies one episode of a larger campaign to control the social studies curriculum and the way the past is presented in public schools. So this goes hand in hand with contested memory, which I will talk about in a couple of slides. But basically, if you look to the right, this textbook is a perfect example of a whitewashed history that many young elementary school students are kind of faced with. And if you read the paragraph, it says when the European settlers arrived, they needed land to live on. The First Nations peoples agreed to move to different areas to make room for new settlements. So, kind of instead of presenting students, even at an early age, with some sort of true and accurate representation of how the United States took part in history can, severely impact the way a whitewashed education has taken control over curriculum and how, using textbooks such as these for students to work in and read, it pushes a trend of mainstreamed historical representations that white textbook writers want to uphold, and how, they use these through belief of, what is acceptable content to present to its students. And rarely are white textbook writers focusing on how these memories are inaccurate and how, later down the line in a student's education, this will severely impact their overall understanding of not only the United States' position in history, but kind of how these events unfolded and how they've impacted today's day and age. So, a continuation of, control of representation. This continuation of whitewashing causes students to lack the necessary skills in order to make sense of a complex world, as they're only given a hegemonic interpretation of past events. So, you know, by cleansing historical records of unwanted events, perspectives, and voices, it upholds the oppression and institutionalized racism that our textbooks are completely designed through. And, it causes teachers to blindly follow this proposed curricula that only presents history in Americanized fashion, that it doesn't include, the voices and perspectives and, primary sources and opinions of minorities and of different locations and countries, and how we directly affected them by our policy creations and our government and our votes, and how kind of our overall nature of how our education system teaches its students. And, this goes directly into, textbook approaches and how, the traditional approaches to American history fail to accurately represent more than an American side of an event, like I said previously. And, instead of incorporating these viewpoints of the opposite sides, American textbooks and curriculum only focus on an American identity by creating the ideology of a great nation, of, a false identity of what America really is, and kind of how America became to be what it is. And, for an example, textbooks kind of fail to question Truman's decision to drop the bomb. And, these textbooks don't really include the perspectives of, like Japanese civilians. They focus on how great the American military is and how great decisions political leaders make, and how that's designed to really propel the United States into, a better standing that's above other countries. And this is kind of where the fault of textbooks lie, is that they need to have a different perspective in order for students to kind of accurately analyze historical events and create their own understanding of them, and how it kind of connects into later years in their education and, current events. And it really kind of doesn't allow students to have an appropriate understanding of how the United States really functions. So, due to the notion that history textbooks are at the center of instruction, they're of the utmost importance to analyze in order for, students to draw on American and world history. And since corporate publishers make decisions about perspectives, voice, evidence, and organization, the overall perspective from which the narrative is told ultimately excludes an accurate historical analysis. So this, goes back into Truman's decision to bomb, and, the Americanized representation of slavery and Christopher Columbus, and uh, relations with minority groups and the Middle East, and kind of every representation that the Americanized textbooks have fails to represent minorities. So, the exclusion of an accurate representation in history textbooks falls back on the common nature of marginalizing minority groups, which unfortunately is a very big theme in, the United States education system. And, if teachers do not break the repeated nature of using whitewashed textbooks, they continue to create a repressed social studies education, which, this necessarily doesn't fall back on the teachers if they're not fully aware of how whitewashed, historical events are represented in American textbooks. So the more teachers analyze their own primary sources and come across other literature and materials that are written from the perspective of Black historians, Asian historians, Middle Eastern historians, European historians, it opens a wide array of viewpoints that, then teachers can hand to their students. So, contested memory is also an overarching theme that's present in whitewashed education through the usage of textbooks and materials. So, this kind of goes along with the overall acknowledgement of war and the United States part, and remembering such events that, present a controversial nature of the creation of American textbooks. So, if you look at the Vietnam War, it's a perfect example for teachers to create a learning environment for students to learn about how evidence, interpretation, and perspectives play an enormous role in a historical narrative. So while looking at the Vietnam War, there are three major perspectives that American textbooks write upon, which is the orthodox, revisionist, and critical. So the orthodox perspective synthesizes the blindness Americans possess in regard to the illusion of the American military. So kind of placing the American military above all else and, making it seem like it's such a great thing that even though it oppresses other minority groups that, there's no fault in the American military. Revisionist perspective presents the idea that efforts by the United States took were noble and, they made no mistakes. And finally, the critical perspective represents the perspectives on American politics and leaders. So kind of how American textbooks represent these politicians and leaders and don't really talk about how their policies and their decisions and votes affect others. So while looking at slavery, instead of presenting an accurate depiction of slavery, students are kind of fed narratives that allude to the notion of what slavery actually was. So a perfect example is students being taught in school that slaves were paid laborers who were happy to live in the horrible conditions provided by slaveholders and slave masters. And I actually focused my senior honors thesis on the effects of marginalized women in Jamaican slavery, and I came across a lot of primary sources that were written from the perspectives of white slaveholders and owners, and they're even written from a perspective that's, very narrow and doesn't really include, the perspectives and thoughts of slaves. So this is a great opportunity for teachers to have for, students to analyze these primary sources in regard to contested memory and how, it's written in such a narrow white perspective. Christopher Columbus is also a great example how he's represented in such a way, that causes students to believe that he was the greatest explorer, a friend to the native peoples, and he discovered new lands, and it kind of fails to explain to students at a young age that this is a really big falsification of who he was. He committed mass murder and, raped Native American women and, tortured and killed them in order to advance, the overall settlement of Europeans. So basically, a notion of blindly following a whitewashed curricula causes minority students to be faced with an environment that's so uncomfortable they are unable to express a true representation of their own histories. And, even though the United States is largely populated by moral individuals who frequently reject bigotry and white supremacy, much of that same population simultaneously is blinded and fooled by a white power structure in American education. So this is basically another way to kind of state that, even though people are against bigotry and racism and white supremacy, that they're not fully aware of how American textbooks uphold these white power structures in American education. So in order to create change, there needs to be a big cultural change and shift in American education in order to combat, blind whitewashing of the education system and the creation of textbooks. And, teachers need to incorporate more literature and resources and perspectives of the opposite side of an American history to kind of have these tough conversations about, the decisions that American leaders and the Americans as a whole have, had and how they oppress others and how this directly impacts a student's education for the worse instead of, having these discussions that need to be had in order for students to be more accepting of others and to have a more accurate representation of what, history is. So ultimately, in order to kind of create some sort of a change, teachers need to allow students to have a chance to, really speak to what these materials are to them and, how they affect their own understanding and how their understanding can be changed for the better when they're faced with other materials that aren't written by white historians and are written through an array of viewpoints. So these are the references that I used. There's also a lot of textbooks and primary sources that if you literally just Google whitewashed textbooks or whitewashed history events, there's an array of things that you can read that kind of go into a lot more detail about the effects of a whitewashed history.